Reconciliation commissions always forsake justice for the purpose of achieving truth and reconciliation. However, not only can these commissions not achieve their purpose, they also forsake fundamental legal principles. We as side proposition believe that even in cases of genocide and human rights violations, legal principles still must apply. There should be no exception or no special circumstance that allows for the usage and incorporation of truth and reconciliation commissions. We believe that criminal prosecution is both the right and effective way to go because truth and reconciliation committees fail to achieve their original objectives and they make things worse. So a few definitions for today. In truth and reconciliation commissions, there are usually two processes. Firstly, witnesses who are identified as victims of gross human rights violations will be invited to give statements about their experiences, and some of them might be selected for public hearings. Secondly, perpetrators of the violence could also, give their testimonies and then after that request for amnesty from both civil and criminal prosecution. An example of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is that in South Africa after the apartheid, where the commission was empowered to grant amnesty to those who committed abuses as long as A, the crimes were politically motivated, B, the crimes were proportionate, and C, there was full disclosure by the individual seeking amnesty. No thank you, sir. And if the perpetrators failed to turn themselves in and were later found out, they would then be prosecuted. By criminal prosecution, we mean that the accused would be prosecuted for his crimes and given a fair trial before acquitting him if he were innocent or meting out proportionate punishment if he were to be found guilty. Our policy consists of three main aspects. Number one, courts will be jointly established by both international and local judges. This not only ensures impartial ruling, no thank you sir, but it also prevents victors' justice from occurring. An example of such courts would be that of the International Criminal Tribunal in Rwanda, whereby the Prime Minister was convicted for rape and genocide.
Points of information.
No thank you. Second point in our policy, we are going to adopt the Nuremberg principles where we will prosecute mainly the people who are on top of the hierarchy and who are the mastermind of these violations. However, this is not a definitive and if necessary, we will also prosecute certain other individuals if need be. Third of all, plea bargaining will also be included in our process whereby it will be an aspect for us to obtain crucial evidence and witnesses' account. So our baseline for today is simple, that Truth and Reconciliation Commissions fail to achieve their original objectives and they make things worse. No thank you, sir. Today we'll bring to you four main points of substantive. I'll be speaking on how these commissions firstly undermine justice and secondly do not achieve truth and reconciliation. While my second speaker will be speaking to you about the prosecution of a repressive ideology and the exploitation of these commissions. So on to my first point. The thesis of my point is this. Truth and reconciliation commissions, hold on a minute sir, undermine justice because they break the coherence of the legal system and they contradict legal principles. What do you have to say to that?
Would side proposition try Nelson Mandela?
So yes, we would try Nelson Mandela because that is in tandem with the policy that we have mentioned. Now back to my point. That as I was mentioning, the thesis of my point is that Truth and Reconciliation Commissions break the coherence of the legal system and contradict legal principles because it allows for variation in outcome, and we think this variation is both inconsistent and unjust. What is justice? We think the nature of justice is about righting the wrongs that are done to the individual and to society. No thank you, sir. So what this means is that a crime or a criminal has to be punished for his transgressions, and that is the consequence of committing the crime in order to deter him and the rest of society from committing similar crimes. And we think that repentance is something that is aside from the verdict if he is ascertained to be guilty. Why? Because repentance doesn't affect guilt. They both exist as separate entities. And even in legal principles in the status quo, repentance is only used for things like mitigation. So therefore, we think that punishment must be what follows guilt. And guilt without punishment is in effect not guilt. So therefore, we as side proposition believe that we are not willing to let someone off as long as he repents because A, the act is still committed and it's still wrong and he needs to suffer for having committed this crime. B, because the victim wants to see that the criminal is punished, to see that the criminal is suffering for having committed the crime and for violating the conscience of society. No thank you sir. And C, because we think that these commissions are easily abused because anyone can simply go forth and and repent and then go off scot-free. So I give you an example of the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whereby it's especially important for us to prosecute the criminals because the crimes that are committed were that of a very large and destructive scale, and we simply cannot allow these crimes to slide with a simple and mere apology. So therefore, we at Side Proposition believe in allowing reconciliation and restitution for the victim, and we think the victim will never be satisfied emotionally with just a simple apology, and we simply cannot allow perpetrators of gross human rights abuses to be let off so easily.
Point of information, madam.
Yes, sir.
Madam, why would you only try the commanders and the leaders of
So if you had listened to my policy, we are not just, we are going to try mainly the commanders, but if necessary and there are individuals who are complicit or actively involved in the crimes, then yes, we will still try them if necessary as well. So back to my point, we think that the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions undermine justice and the belief in the law. Why? Because law is selectively being applied, and this contravenes the principle of equality and fairness. Because we believe that all laws must apply regardless of the scenario, and otherwise it will merely lead to disbelief and distrust in the justice system. And because laws make up society, we need society to believe and to have faith in the justice system, not undermine it. In contrast, we believe that criminal prosecution both achieves and serves justice because criminals are caught and brought to trial and then being sentenced the appropriate punishment that he deserves. And justice is crucial because it is a prerequisite to achieving true reconciliation. And on to my second point on how Truth and Reconciliation Commissions fail to achieve national unity and fails to achieve genuine and true reconciliation. Two levels from this. First of all, that on an individual level, and second, on a societal level. We think that on an individual level, there can never be true reconciliation achieved. Why? Because the victim himself is not actively involved in forgiving the perpetrator. Why? Because the concept of forgiveness is such that it pertains to the individual himself. Forgiveness is for me to give, and it must be freely given by me. The state is not me, and the state doesn't know me, and therefore the state cannot impose decisions for me. We think what happens in Truth and Reconciliation Commissions is that forgiveness is institutionalized, and there's a criterion that is being established for forgiveness to be given. This effectively destroys the principle because there were very clearly victims who are both unwilling to forgive the perpetrators, however, they cannot do anything about it. Second of all, on a societal level, what happens is that people feel that crimes are simply being swept under the carpet because nothing concrete is being done about it. We are imposing a national narrative of what has happened onto the entire population, which may or may not be true because TRCs often compromise stories due to its reconciliation. I give the example of Sri Lanka's Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, where the report failed to cover much of the sexual abuse caused by the Tamils by Sinhalese. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, because TRCs don't achieve truth and reconciliation and they make things worse, I'm extremely proud to stand on the side of the proposition.
Today, Side Proposition is proud, opposition is proud to be the side that looks at the long term. We stand for reconciliation and the recovery that comes about from Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and we reject the notion of short-term gratification by trials. Today, Side Opposition stands for 3 lines of analysis. I'll be telling you about the principles of justice and societal reconciliation, while my second speaker, Rabin, will be talking to you about disempowering the rhetoric of oppression. But first of all, how are we intending to achieve this? Our policy is simple. We give amnesty to anyone who fully cooperates with Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. By fully cooperating, this means that there needs to be an active cooperation and partnership with the committee in the investigations and procedures. We think it's not enough for someone to just say, I'm sorry. In our policy, amnesty is given to people who follow on and cooperate entirely with the investigations. But more than this, we think that anyone who refuses to cooperate with the Commission will have to undergo punitive measures in contempt of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is very much like what we see in the Reconciliation Commission of Fiji, where perpetrators who refused to cooperate had to pay a fine of $5,000 or serve 2 years imprisonment. This is because we are trying them for hindering the process of reconciliation, and this is the charge that we are charging them for. But first of all, before I move on to my substantive, allow me to move on to my rebuttals. I'm going to be giving you 3 lines of rebuttals in terms of their policy, in terms of justice, in terms of moving on. In terms of the justice, first of all, we ask them who is going to commit who is going to carry this out. And they simply told us very shortly, it's going to be achieved together with international communities, international commissions. We asked them who specifically is going to commit this. If their solution is the International Criminal Court, or if their solution is the UN tribunals, they need to show us why they're willing to do this and why it's capable. But more than this, we asked them, how is it going to be achieved? And first of all, they told us initially on the concept of command responsibility, where they're only going to try the people directly involved in commanding executive role in the crimes. Rabin asked the first speaker in the POI, hold on a minute, if you want to stick to your principles of legal justice, how are you going to? Why is it fair that you're only going to try the commanders? They never came back to us on this. In fact, they shifted and said, maybe we're going to try those who are slightly responsible if necessary. We asked them, what do they mean by if necessary? Because anyone involved in the regime will necessarily need to be tried. In their case, they want to stand for the principles of justice, because not one of them were innocent in the apartheid regime, for instance, because of the for failing to condemn the regime. But moreover, we asked them about the principles of justice, where we put forth to you that legal justice means that you need to prosecute everyone. And this very much goes back to policy attacks. If they were to prosecute everyone involved in the regime, we think that it's an administrative hassle. But more than this, we asked them in the POI, are you going to try Nelson Mandela? And they said, yes. Hold on a minute. Are they arguing in the real world? If Nelson Mandela was tried and put in jail, where would South Africa be today? The cornerstone of reform, the cornerstone of the new regime. They need to argue with us in the real world how their policy is going to take place. Yes, sir.
Are you then going to grant amnesty to Al-Assad for having killed so many people?
Yes, sir. We are going to grant amnesty to anyone who completely cooperates with our investigation, because we think in the long term this is better for society. But finally, on the point of justice, I'll be talking to you more later on in my substantive for how justice is in fact achieved in our case, because we're not just warmongering, we take into consideration the social, societal construct of justice in terms of allowing society to move on. But finally, this brings me very nicely to the final point of contention on moving on. And they simply told us, in the first speaker's own words, that state cannot decide for me. That was the first speaker's own words. And we asked them, really? In normal society, states decide for people all the time. In trial cases, courts always decide who is responsible. The next speaker has to come up and tell us why states cannot decide for them, why in times of, why this policy still stands. So thank you, sir. I'm going to be transiting on to my substantive now, on the principle of justice. And the thesis for this point is that truth and reconciliation commissions uphold justice by actively seeking out the truth rather than persecution. And I have two lines of argument to prove this point, in terms of achieving confessions and in terms of rehabilitative justice. In terms of confessions, TRCs, through providing amnesty and absolution for cooperative parties, encourages parties involved and perpetrators to allow full disclosure of what they did wrong during the regime. Why can this never occur in TRCs, in trials? We think that this is because it is within the vested interest of these individuals to flee the jurisdiction of the country the moment they hear that they're going for trial. More than this, we see this as an example of the commanders of the Lord's Republican Army in Uganda, where up till today, no one is held accountable for the villages of people pillaged, murdered, and raped. We think that in their case, they have no way to prove the practicalities of that point. But more than this, we think it's not going to work in their case either in terms of trials, because people involved will likely cover up their mistakes so as to achieve lighter sentences. They need to deal with these points in terms of proving truth. We think that in the TRC, when we say you are apologetic, you come clean with what you've done, you tell us exactly what you do, you'll get amnesty. We think that this is a far better way to get truth. Why is it so important that we get truth? And this is because of rehabilitative justice, where basically under TRC, victims' testimonies engage the entire population and cater to the different needs of people. Why can trials never achieve rehabilitative justice? This is because trials inherently only involve a certain amount of people. Only the people who have strategic benefit to the prosecution of the alleged criminal. We think that this does not include society, this does not allow society to rehabilitate, this is not justice, because the truth can never come out in society and the social benefits of justice can never be achieved. I'm going to be transiting on to my second substantive now, which is on societal reconciliation. And the thesis for this is that in order to have societal reconciliation, truth and reconciliation commissions are needed to reconcile the divides in society. Yes, ma'am?
So unfortunately, true reconciliation can never be achieved until and unless real justice has been served, which doesn't happen.
You need to prove to us this assertion, because it is not enough to simply tell us it cannot be achieved. Just as found in substantives generally refer to assertions, we think that they need to come up with the second speaker to tell us why this is specifically the case. In fact, we have proven to you convincingly in the first substantive how justice is achieved in our case, truth is allowed, reconciliation is allowed. My second substantive, moving right back, sir. to my substantive, is about firstly not having victors' justice and how this leads to equalizing the different groups, which allows reconciliation. But why is it that we don't allow victors' justice? This is because trials inherently always benefit the victors. Don't let them lie to you that even that with international help, victors' justice won't occur. We see this in an example of Iraq. We see this in an example of the trials of Saddam Hussein, where just because the United States of America was involved in the victory, Shiites and Kurds were given an unfair advantage in the courtroom against the Sunni regime. Even with participation of international bodies, even with the participation of the United States of America, we think that victors' justice will always occur, victims will always suffer. But more than this, we think that this will lead to we think it's necessary for Truth and Reconciliation Commissions because it leads to the equalizing of different groups based on analysis of the first tier. This is because under TRCs, both sides of the party, the larger picture is viewed, both sides of the party, both sides involved in the conflict are viewed holistically for what they have done. We see this in the TRC in South Africa, where both white Africans and the black indigenous people were both viewed equally for the wrongs they've done. And this is why we think reconciliation occurs better in our case because if we equalize the different groups, both people involved in the conflict are viewed equally. This allows the reconstruction of society in the future. So what have I shown you today? I've shown you that their policy is unfeasible. They haven't given us an airtight policy. It doesn't exist in the real world. I've also shown to you how justice is better achieved in our case. We are not so interested in warmongering. We are more interested in the long-term stability and reconstruction of society. For that reason, I'm proud to oppose.
Side opposition wants us to reconcile. They want reconciliation. But truthfully, ladies and gentlemen, if someone kills your family and he gets away with it by simply telling his story at a commission, will you ever forgive him? Ladies and gentlemen, the link that side proposition is telling you today is that in order for any form of reconciliation to occur, the victims must first forgive the perpetrators. Only then can we agree on a sense of unity. Only then can we agree on a national narrative that we all stand by. That is what side proposition is standing for. And with that, I have three main points of rebuttals for the House today. The first, about the policies of side proposition and opposition. The second, about the entire idea of whether the state can decide for us or not. And lastly, about true justice. So on the first main point of contention about the policy. Side opposition tells us today that they're going to grant amnesty to anyone as long as they fully cooperate. Our first question then is, ladies and gentlemen, at what point can we define that this individual is fully cooperating with us? How do we expect to verify that this individual is giving us all the information that he has within that he knows of? Ladies and gentlemen, such an ambiguous definition of cooperation will only lead to the exploitation of amnesty. Now what this means is that we are talking about the amnesty being granted to individuals such as Al-Assad, who has killed thousands of innocent civilians. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't think it's right. The second point of argument they gave us today was that they questioned us, who is going to do it, the United Nations or what? We think it's pretty clear that my first speaker has told you that there will be a cooperation between local judges and international judges. We think that what we are doing in such a case is that we are ensuring impartiality. What we want to do here is we want to prevent victors' justice by the very presence of these international judges. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, my first speaker spoke to you about how we will actually not blindly abide the Nuremberg principles, but we will extend these principles. And they ask us how. And we're going to tell you that if the leader of a certain state reviews that a plot to say massacre a certain ethnicity within the country was carried out independent of his decision, independent of his knowledge, we think that the commander of such a scheme should thereby be prosecuted. And we think that this is how it works. More importantly, ladies and gentlemen, recognize that side proposition stands by a criminal court. We believe that in terms of a criminal prosecution, we have plea bargaining. So we think that this is an incentive for individuals to offer knowledge for us to prosecute the right individuals. On my second main point of rebuttal about whether the state can decide for us or not. At this point, I'll just point out that the first opposition speaker never dealt with my first speaker's arguments about reconciliation, about the justice system. They only told us today that the state should be allowed to decide for us. But ladies and gentlemen, the difference between our two worlds today is that on side opposition world, they tell you that once the Truth and Reconciliation Committee ends, that's the end of the story. You are expected to forgive the individual. On side proposition, we offer you criminal prosecution. We understand that victims want to see their perpetrators get punished. We understand this is important and integral for forgiveness to be meted out. On my last main point of rebuttal about true justice, the first argument they gave us today was that people won't turn in. Then this is where we'll offer you the example of East Timor, where the Truth and Reconciliation Committee was set up. We had over 8,000 testimonies being submitted, my apologies, and we had nobody, and we had over 8,000 testimonies being submitted by perpetrators. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an example of how perpetrators themselves would actually step forward to redress their sins. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, recognize that it's precisely because we stand for criminal prosecution that we have the full strength of the legal system calling for these individuals to step up, as compared to side opposition, which depends on the goodwill of these individuals to confess their sins. The second argument he gave us today was that of societal reconciliation. And this is when I'll give you the example of Sri Lanka, where the Truth and Reconciliation Committee established a national narrative. But in the process, only 34% of those interviewed were white Africans. And in such a case, ladies and gentlemen, what happened was that we did not manage to agree on the national narrative which the entire country could stand by, and this is how Truth and Reconciliation Committees failed. So let me now move on to my two main arguments for the House today. The first, about the prosecution of not just an individual, but an ideology, and the second, about the exploitation of Truth and Reconciliation Committees. My first argument for today about the prosecution of a repressive ideology is that when we prosecute head of states, we're not merely prosecuting him for the act that he committed, not for just a murder, but we are prosecuting the values, the ideology, and the principles that we stand for. Don't you agree, sir?
Sir, would you prosecute the German race for keeping silent about Jewish concentration camps?
Sir, yes we would, because we think that in such a scenario, if we were required to prosecute them for an act of omission, if they did not assist in the saving of these concentration camps, we would prosecute them. So let me move back to my point, right? Ladies and gentlemen, when we prosecute individuals, say for example in Rwanda, when we prosecuted the Hutus for the genocide of the Tutsis, we're not just prosecuting them for the genocide, but we're prosecuting them for the fact that they stood for principles like xenophobia, like discrimination and hate. We think that what we are doing on the side of opposition is that we are going beyond the mere act of prosecuting an individual, but we are doing something more long-lasting. We are allowing society to stand together as a collective body to condemn these values, and we think that this is important. I give you the example of the Nuremberg trials, where we condemn the Nazis for what they're doing, their anti-Semitic ideals. And we think that this, in fact, has had an influence on the world today, where we see many nations making it illegal for their citizens to deny Holocaust. This is exactly what side proposition is talking about. Let me move on to my second argument today, about the exploitation of Truth and Reconciliation Committees. And under this, two main lines of logic. The first, about international communities' attitude, for a moment, sir, towards such conflicts. And the second, about dictatorships. Yes, sir.
Prove to us the point of reconciliative justice when all your leaders of change, like Nelson Mandela, are sitting in jail cells.
So we think that when we talk about reconciliation, we are talking about victims agreeing to forgive their victors. We can never expect any victim to forgive their perpetrator just because they apologize. We don't think that's enough. And we need side opposition to acknowledge that too. So let me move back to my main point of argument. So firstly, ladies and gentlemen, when we have TRCs being endorsed and acknowledged by international community, that's a viable way forward. We think that this brings forth a defeatist attitude, right? The moment we have a certain nation that has chaos, and the moment we are unable to gather sufficient evidence of find perpetrators, we simply turn to TRCs. We don't think that's right, because at the end of the day, every individual should have the right to gain reparations. My second line of logic is that of dictatorships. Recognize that since the establishment of TRCs, this simply means that dictators are able to get an easy way out for the crimes they have committed. We think that what happens is that dictators are able to simply set up a TRC, cooperate fully, and gain amnesty. We don't think that's right for the thousands and millions of innocent people who have died. And I give you the example of how this has happened in Chile, where the TRC was set up, and where the military junta in Chile was able to escape prosecution simply due to the exploitation of TRCs. At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, go with the side that stands with justice, go with the side that understands how reconciliation is done, go with the side of your proposition.
My speech proper, I'd like to point out a few things which their side hasn't dealt with. They never brought up Marx's attacks, and they never defended their policy from Marx's attacks on its feasibility. They never told us why the aggressors and the perpetrators of a repressive regime won't just flee the country, making it impossible for us to gain truth. And they never responded to our arguments about leveling the playing field and allowing groups to better achieve reconciliation and amnesty. So I've got three main questions for their policy today. First of all, is their policy coherent and viable? The answer is no. Secondly, are truth and reconciliation commissions or trials more just? The answer is truth and reconciliation commissions. That's why we use them. And thirdly, are TRCs effective in achieving reconciliation and finding truth? The answer is yes. So, they asked us how we define cooperation and how we find the truth. We have a very simple answer to this. The same way they do it under their model in a court system. The TRC has the ability to summon witnesses and to use physical corroboration to tell if a person who's asking for amnesty is telling the truth, and that's how we see whether he's cooperating or not. They told us that international organizations will magically ensure that truth and reconciliation commissions are, that trials, are never biased. But here's the problem. International organizations, thank you, always have a vested interest in ensuring that one side emerges triumphant in a dispute between two, thank you, over the history of the regime. We give the example of Bosnia, where UN and NATO lawyers were contracted to help in local trials to find truth, openly favored the Croats and the Bosnians over the Serbs because they were pandering to the interests of the United States and America, which had an interest in ensuring that these two sides were whitewashed of all guilt. They talked to us about plea bargaining and how they're going to allow some people to go off scot-free in return for thank you for aiding court processes by giving information about others. Now this is very funny because it's a principal concession. It means that some people aren't going to be brought to justice under their policy, thank you, so we think they don't actually know what they're standing for. And finally, thank you, the biggest contradiction of their case so far. In their first speaker, they came up and told us that they're only going to prosecute the people at the heads of these regimes, thank you. We asked them why, they didn't really give us an answer. And when we gave a POI to the second speaker, they told you that we're going to prosecute entire races, entire regimes, including ordinary people, ordinary policemen, ordinary foot soldiers, for their complicity in crimes against humanity. We asked, why is there a difference between the two stances? Until they resolve these stances and show us that they've been consistent so far, we don't think they've won this debate. And finally, they told us that people aren't going to turn up and report to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We said that they are because they have the incentive of amnesty, which they can get if they cooperate, and even if they don't always turn up under their model, it's far less likely, thank you, that they're going to turn up in front of a court where they'll be prosecuted and punished. So I dealt with their policy. Moving on to my second area of rebuttals about whether truth and reconciliation commissions or trials are more just. They told us that retribution is a sacrosanct principle of justice. We say no. Justice is about creating a society where everyone can achieve his or her conception of the good life. If reconciliation does this better than retribution, why not? We asked them whether they try Nelson Mandela. They said yes. We think that this would have created a South Africa where the blacks were permanently disenfranchised, thank you, where the blacks were permanently bitter against the whites. We don't think this is a very good thing for society. They told us that justice in the form of retribution must always come before reconciliation because the victims aren't going to forgive the perpetrators. That's the whole point of a TRC, ladies and gentlemen. It's a work in progress. It allows people to realize that everyone is equally guilty, that everyone has been equally complicit in the regime, and everyone has suffered, and that's how they slowly come to forgive their oppressors. So moving on to my final area of rebuttal, whether we are effective in promoting reconciliation and therefore truth. They tell us that we won't prosecute ideologies. But in Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, thank you, the very people who created an ideology come up and renounce it. We think that this is the best form of destroying these ideologies and discrediting them. We say that dictators, thank you, don't get an easy way out. And even if they do, we think it's sometimes necessary to help society move forward. So I'm moving on to my point of substantive about disempowering the rhetoric profession. And the thesis of my argument is that making forgiveness part of the collective historical memory of a society allows Truth and Reconciliation Commissions to disempower the rhetoric profession. The premise of this point, hold on a minute man, is that the foundational cause of all genocidal and all oppressive systems is a contrived history of perpetual conflict. But before I explain this premise, yes madam?
Sir, your collective narrative is not one that is acceptable by everyone as shown in the example in Sri Lanka.
Madam, we don't think that's relevant. What we're trying to prove to you here is that dictators use a narrative of conflict to mislead people into supporting policies which oppress one group for the benefit of another, and that's what we take down. So dictators use this narrative to gain support for policies by otherizing a minority or a specific class in society. They construct a history of perpetual conflict between this group and everyone else. Thus, the Jews become the eternal enemies of Aryans, and thus the blacks become the abiding enemies of whites under the South African regime. When society believes that conflict with an enemy minority is perpetual and predestined, they believe that it's justified, and this increases the likelihood that they'll support oppressive policies, because now they can say, we've always been fighting them, we've always been oppressing them, no thank you, and that's why we're justified in doing it even now. Courts don't solve this problem, because they perpetuate the historical narrative of conflict. Courts are confrontational because they end up pitting one group against another. Look at the courts of Rwanda, where mostly Hutu leaders were prosecuted by judges and lawyers who were almost entirely Hutu. Look at Peru, where Catholics were prosecuted in court by judges and lawyers who were almost entirely secular. This is bad because, no thank you, it allows the future leaders of racial or social groups to justify oppression of minorities, to justify oppression of others by using the rhetoric of perpetual historical conflict and saying, no thank you madam, they did this to us before, therefore we are justified in hitting them now. But our model is far better. Hold on a minute, sir. Because Truth and Reconciliation Commissions place emphasis on forgiveness and not conflict. Don't you agree, sir?
Only 34% of whites in South Africa agree with the national narrative produced by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You tell us that that is an accurate representation and the national narrative.
Sir, we don't think that's empirically true. If you've gone to South Africa, everyone will tell you how much they admire Nelson Mandela and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Moreover, as I've already told you, these commissions are works in progress. Our model is better because we place an emphasis on forgiveness and not conflict, because we recognize that everyone has been wrong, everyone is responsible in some sense for the system, and that's why forgiveness stems from this sort of realization that your neighbor is equally as guilty as you. Your neighbor has suffered as much as you and was a product of the same system as you. We give the example of Turkmenistan, where both Turkmen and Uzbeks were implicated by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in collaborating with the regime of Sapuramat Niyazov. We give the example of Burundi, where both Hutus and Tutsis who had engaged in conflict there broke down and cried when they realized how much their neighbor had suffered at the hands of the other and how much they were both guilty for this sort of suffering. When this happens, this doesn't happen in courts because only one side can win. There's no recognition of universal guilt. The recognition of universal guilt means that a break occurs in the cycle of conflict and retribution. Rather than a court being another episode in a perpetual history of conflict, we can now say that we have made forgiveness, and this is added to the historical record, and this prevents leaders from creating the kind of contrived narrative of perpetual conflict that I'm talking about, therefore making it far less likely that these groups will continue to engage in conflict. So because TRCs are more effective and more just, go with our view.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Let us examine realistically the side of the opposition. What exactly are they standing for? Firstly, they're standing for amnesty for dictators, such as Al-Assad, who have massacred thousands of people. They're okay with people getting away with that. Let's examine what happens if Truth and Reconciliation Commissions find these people guilty. In the case of South Africa, 5,000 over applications of amnesty were rejected, ladies and gentlemen. What happens after Truth and Reconciliation is still criminal prosecution, ladies and gentlemen. This is the reality that we live in, ladies and gentlemen. Criminal prosecution will still occur under their model today. And even if we follow their policy of punitive measures, are we really okay? Is society really okay with a $2,000 fine or 5 years in jail, ladies and gentlemen, for people who have committed gross human rights abuses, ladies and gentlemen? We say it's not acceptable. Before I move on to my two main points of contention, let's point out the slight, thank you sir, contradiction on the side of the opposition. In first, they said that they will grant Al-Assad amnesty, but in second, they said that they will charge him under the Nuremberg principle. So what exactly is side opposition standing for? On to my two main points of contention. Now, they first brought up this entitlement, thank you sir, on the entitlement. on my first main point of contention, on what exactly is best for justice. They propose a passive model on their side, which voluntarily encourages people to come forward because there's a certain incentive. We've shown you in reality that that doesn't happen. We've given you examples of East Timor, of Sri Lanka, where no perpetrator has come forth simply because there is still a victor in any civil war, ladies and gentlemen. The fundamental nature, no thank you sir, of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions is as such that the government, the person in charge of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions is the government, ladies and gentlemen. And thus, there are no perpetrators from the winning side has no incentive to come forth. And furthermore, they have no enforcement mechanism on their side, simply because the governments will turn a blind eye, as in the case of East Timor and Sri Lanka, ladies and gentlemen. I challenge a third opposition speaker to deal with these examples and how realistically they'll enforce policy on both sides. Now, furthermore, we brought you this entire notion of the need to uphold justice, simply because justice has to be applied equally to every single individual, simply because justice is about who believes in it, ladies and gentlemen. We need to apply justice, hold on a moment, sir, equally to the entire society, for society to believe in it. What kind of logic on their side is if we prosecute a murderer for one murder and let mass murderers go scot-free, ladies and gentlemen? That is what they're essentially proposing. What do you have to say to that, sir?
So you need to deal with the fact that in sectarian violence, both sides are involved, both sides are responsible.
So then, under our model, under the international tribunal model that we've proposed, then we will prosecute everyone on both sides, ladies and gentlemen. And victors' justice is less likely to happen on our side because we have international regulation, as in the case of the International Criminal Tribunal in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, ladies and gentlemen. These are successive models. There are policies modeled after. And we have shown you that in the case of reconciliation and these commissions, they do not work. Back to my point on the entire notion of why we need to uphold justice. We've told you that society needs to believe in these laws, and thus they have to be applied equally, ladies and gentlemen. Then they brought up this entire notion about how, whether we would consider plea bargaining or the prosecution of Nelson Mandela. We've told you that we have a system of plea bargaining where we're not setting the person scot-free. We're considering mitigating factors that will affect his sentencing, ladies and gentlemen, but not his guilt. So, what we're essentially saying is that we cannot absorb the guilt of the individual, but we can consider the different mitigating factors involved, and that's essentially what our case is about. Moving on to the next point, on the entire notion of victors' justice. We've given you points, we've given you examples in South Africa, where only 34% of whites in South Africa agree with the national, narrative proposed by these Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. We see that it's still divided along racial lines, and we've given you countless examples of such. But back on to the next point, on the entire notion of reconciliation. Who best achieves reconciliation? We've told you that individual reconciliation has to come first, because the state cannot decide for me if I am to forgive the person or not, ladies and gentlemen. Under their paradigm today, the state is essentially imposing when an individual should or should not forgive these perpetrators. And we say that that doesn't help with individual reconciliation, which eventually contributes to national unity, ladies and gentlemen. If individuals cannot forgive the person, then there's no national unity. No, thank you, sir. And they have to prove to us why national unity will still exist under the paradigm despite individual reconciliation not being achieved. On to my next point, on the entire notion of real forgiveness. We see the end point that both sides would like to achieve is real forgiveness. But real forgiveness only, thank you, sir, come about when I have a choice and I choose and I'm empowered whether I want to forgive the person or not, ladies and gentlemen. If the state arbitrarily chooses for me, then we say that there's no reconciliation, there's no real forgiveness. On to my next point, on the entire notion of the long-term abuse, which was my second speaker's substantive that they have not dealt with. My second speaker told you that this system is open to abuse, as in the case of Chile, as in the case of Sri Lanka, where these dictators and the military junta will simply demand for amnesty before even setting up these courts of truth and reconciliation. Hold on a moment, sir. So the only people that's only really coming forth are those who are ordered by the military junta in these transgressions. Do you not agree?
If on your side the state can decide who to punish, thereby channeling the will of the community, why can't it decide who to forgive?
So we have told you that individual criminal prosecution comes when the state chooses to punish someone or not. But it doesn't dictate whether I have a right to forgive the person or not, ladies and gentlemen. And criminal prosecution still allows truth and reconciliation to occur. Back to my point on the entire notion of how this results in abuse. We've told you that this will allow dictators such as Al-Assad to go away scot-free, and that's something we cannot stand for. On to my second point of contention, on how best do we heal society. Their second speaker came up in his substantive
point of information,
told us that we are allowing society to decide a national narrative. But this narrative that they speak of is heavily compromised, because then you have an incentive to hide instances of abuse, as in the case of Sri Lanka, where the Sinhalese government did not mention any transgressions on the side of the Sinhalese government, while the entire report spoke of transgressions by the Tamil Tiger, ladies and gentlemen. The national narrative on their side is untrue, and this will only result in polarizing accounts, as in my second speaker's substantive, where polarizing accounts of what actually happened arise, and this only allows society to be fragmented and split along racial lines even further, ladies and gentlemen. So ethnic groups will no longer buy to the national narrative that they speak of, thereby dealing with his second speaker's substantive on the entire notion of a national narrative. How does our side achieve this national narrative? Simply because criminal prosecution allows facts and truths to be discussed in court, ladies and gentlemen. This allows for the truth to be examined and analyzed on our side. And this allows for an accurate depiction of what exactly happened, instead of a compromised account on their side. So on our side, we best achieve a national narrative that all individuals can believe in. We best achieve national unity. We best achieve reconciliation for the individual. What would the side of the proposition?
Nelson Mandela once said that action is far more important than rhetoric. Today, they've talked a lot about action, but their action is an unjust action, it is a victor's action, and it's an action which is fundamentally fueled by retribution and not by the long-term growth of society. I'm going to show you how they're wrong in three areas. Firstly, on the principles of justice. Secondly, on the integrity of the two mechanisms. And lastly, on the long-term growth of society. So let's first talk about the concept of justice. Now here they've talked about how justice is fundamentally an adherence to legal principles, and this adherence to legal principles necessitates punishment. But they've conceded from the beginning that they don't punish anyone involved in the crime. In fact, their first speaker said that they're going to stick to the Nuremberg principles. They're going to stick to command responsibility, and therefore people who are complicit in these crimes, people who committed a crime of omission, don't get punished. They didn't uphold that principle from the beginning. But when we peel at them further and we probe them further, they said that they will prosecute entire races of people, entire communities, and pass condemnation on an entire race for what its leaders did. We don't think that stands and that upholds societal growth and the kind of progress in society that they want to see. But we don't think that justice is only about retribution. In fact, we've told them and we've shown them why they've never actually proved why retribution is intrinsic to justice. Rather, all down the line, we have shown you how justice is a social construct. It is defined by its ability and its effect on society, and that is most clearly seen as an ability to bring about long-term growth, to bring about peace, and to bring about a better tomorrow. They didn't evolve this, they didn't deal with this and clash with this. We showed them how on our side, the TRCs allow for this development and this evolution of the national psyche and the perceptions which may be marked, these perceptions which have caused genocide, these perceptions which have caused crimes against humanity are fundamentally changed because an objective truth comes out. And we told them that even if justice was just about punishment and it was just about creating these kinds of punishment, we told them that that creates a brutality in society. Because what happens is that these courts are adversarial by nature. So what happens in their case is that they increase the amount of conflict that goes on, because fundamentally all society longs for is justice through bloodshed, is justice through incarceration. And we have shown you how that isn't going to happen because of victor's justice. We give you a further example of Biafra, where the Yoruba became a hegemonic group over the Igbo after a conflict, after a winning conflict against them, and because of that, created a court system whereby it was the Igbo who were the ones constantly being prosecuted, the ones constantly being subjected to the death penalty and to life imprisonment. That is the brutal society they live in, and that is the conception of justice that they have. So that isn't a justice which is going to bring respect for the law. That is a justice which sees the law as a tool for the victor's group. And that is one which is never going to be fair. We told them that it's worse in their case because they never deal with the fundamental issues and perceptions which lead to the problems of apartheid, which lead to the problems of genocide. They never allow the people who are responsible for them to come forward and show how the perceptions that they perpetuated are wrong. And in so doing, delegitimize this rhetoric. We did. They talked about how truth does not arise in TRCs. And they said there's an inability to verify testimony, but we told you that's not the case. In fact, in the third, they talked about how there's not going to be an objective narrative. But we told you how there's an extensive pouring over of evidence, that the truth is objective. We give them the example of Guatemala, where over 80% of missing persons were able to be identified and were able to either be confirmed killed in action or killed due to whatever reasons, whether it was part of genocide or part of political repression. We showed them how these fates of missing individuals and identities constitute an objective truth of what really happened. The truth in their case is a truth only preoccupied with establishing guilt. It is not a truth that creates a national narrative. It is a truth that only finds out enough facts to put a person on the stand in jail. No, thank you, madam. We told them about how even if we told them how in their case it's worse because this truth is only defined by its value to condemn. It's not defined by its value to really bring out what happened. And lastly, on the idea of reconciliation, they talked about how forgiveness is individual and the government cannot make a decision. But how can this be the case when this is fundamentally a societal decision in their case as well? When they put these people under courts, the proportionality of the punishment, the type of the punishment, even the judgment of whether he's guilty or not, is fundamentally putting the decision in society's hands and taking it away from the individual. So we don't see how they can stand for not allowing society to vicariously make a judgment and make a decision about how they're going to deal with these crimes. But even if it wasn't, even if forgiveness was individual, we think it's better off in our case. Because the focus of the TRC is on individual reconciliation with the regime. It's about individuals reconciling themselves to a society that created a context where they were wrong, to a society that created a context where they were harmed. Individuals can do this by expressing themselves in TRCs. Individuals can do this by hearing the real and the whole truth. They can't do that in trials because trials are only about prosecution and trials are not about forgiveness. But in their case, there's no assurance of forgiveness either. Are they looking for the harshest punishment? Are they looking for a punishment that feeds and cedes to the demands of a bloodthirsty society? They never said. In fact, we think that in their case, this isn't going to happen. We think in their case, they're going to have a trial which is fundamentally unjust and doesn't bring about the principles of justice. But on to the second idea about the integrity of the mechanism. And here they talked about the objectivity of trials and said trials are objective because the international community is a watchdog. We told you, wait a minute, that's not the case. Trials are never objective because the international community always favors one, hold on a moment, sir, a particular group, usually the victors group, because this is expedient to international political rhetoric, or this is in line with countries' foreign policy, and that makes them look better in the domestic sphere. Go ahead.
So how exactly do you reach an objective truth in countries like Sri Lanka, where the report only focuses on the crimes committed by the Tamil
Look, sir, in your case, you are only going to be focusing on the crimes committed by the Sinhalese government. You're only going to be finding evidence to try these generals. At least on our side of the house, we are looking at individuals' truth, individuals' perceptions, and individuals' perspectives. We fundamentally allow an objective truth untainted by the victors and the political situation within that country. We fundamentally allow for a truth that is timeless and not politically motivated. But moving on, we talked about how theirs is contingent to international rhetoric. In their side, the precise reason why Gaddafi can be executed extrajudicially by the National Transition Council and get away with it is because the United States of America backs the National Transition Council. We think on their side of the house, they aren't going to have any checks and balances. But we see that in their case, what they do is they fundamentally undermine sovereignties of countries by allowing the ICC to come in, by allowing international courts to come in, courts with no conception of local law and no conception of local context. And lastly, we talked about how nobody comes forward, but we told them how amnesty is an incentive, and TRCs create an atmosphere of forgiveness, the same kind of atmosphere that many of these perpetrators are looking to in order for them to reconcile themselves back into society. We saw that in South Africa. We saw that when the jailers and the prisoners from within the apartheid regime could live together again. And lastly, on the idea of prosecuting an ideology. Now, they don't really prosecute an ideology because trials by nature focus on individuals and figureheads. They're retrospective. They don't look towards creating a better, more coherent society. On our side, we address the core reasons for this ideology. That's why you see people in Burundi, both Tutsis and Hutus, breaking down in tears because they realize that their racial differences are not a basis or a justification for them to commit genocide. We see that in our side, we really hit these ideologies because of the intrinsic principles, and their side, they perpetuate divisive rhetoric and they make these dictators into martyrs. We see a very clear case on our side of true justice and a very clear case on their side of injustice.
Robben Island in South Africa was once a place where the victims of the apartheid regime who were strong enough to stand up to it were imprisoned and tortured. But today the former guards on Robben Island and the former prisoners there work together to explain to people how South Africa overcame its differences and how society came together. That's the world we want. That's our vision of society. But their side doesn't want that. Their side stood for a principle which was monolithic, which was tribal, which didn't see beyond the gallows and beyond the whip, and which was contradictory. So let me take you through a walk through the world of side proposition. What kind of justice does side proposition believe in? They screamed at us all down the table, retribution, retribution, retribution. And we asked them, why? What is so important about retribution? They didn't really answer this. They continued baying for blood. We don't think this is very civilized. And they told us that reconciliation can only come after you have seen the other side grilled, humiliated, and totally broken down by the victor. We don't think this is true. This only divides society. And it's made worse by the fact that they would call in international organizations like NATO, who have a vested interest in seeing one side win to conduct these trials, making them even more biased, even more unfair. But then they had a few contradictions in their principles about justice. The first one was quite funny. They told us that we're going to let some people off the hook, people who agreed to strike plea bargains with the government. Now, these are often very important people, and we told you this in Josh, we told you this in Mark, and so we don't think that this really fulfills the principle of justice. But more than that, at the first speaker they told us they're only going to prosecute the leaders of these regimes. But then later they came up and told us that they're going to prosecute every single individual, from civilian to soldier to policeman, who was complicit in oppression. We don't think this is very consistent, and their world wasn't really clear. It was quite murky about what they stood for. In their world, the state is a strange one. It can punish. It can decide who the community wants to punish, who the community wants to lay guilt on, but it can't forgive. We asked them why this should be true, because the state and its institutions represent the people. They never had an answer. But about reconciliation and the truth in their world. In their world, victors seek to vilify the losers, they seek to pin guilt on the other, and the guilt only lands on one side. There's no universal recognition of guilt. They never dealt with our point about that, and they never told us why they would allow the Sinhalese to set up a court and show the world and change the historical narrative to their advantage to justify their oppression. They never dealt with that. So let me take you on a walk through the world of side opposition. A world which isn't perfect, but a world in which better achieves a good life for everyone in society. First, in our world, we talked about justice. And we told you that retribution isn't necessarily the most important principle in justice. Sometimes reconciliation is more important because whatever principle of justice that allows society to come together, stop killing each other, and therefore achieve a better life is the paramount principle of justice. We told you about dictators. We told you that they have to confess to their crimes and therefore acknowledge their guilt so they're not getting away scot-free. But more than that, if sometimes we have to forgive some people and set aside our differences with them so that society can come back together, it's better for all of us in the end. And then we moved on to truth and reconciliation. We told you that our commissions can find truth, and just like their courts, we can collaborate it with witnesses, with physical evidence. And then they told us that we aren't going to achieve reconciliation because people don't accept it. We told you that truth and reconciliation commissions are a work in progress. Yes, not everyone may accept it at first, but once a state shows people the way to forgiveness, they start reconsidering their guilt, the guilt of their oppressors, and realize that everyone has suffered and everyone is guilty, and start slowly accepting that society must come together. We were consistent, and we showed you that a national narrative of forgiveness is most important for society in this sort of circumstances, and this is accepted as time goes by in society because everyone knows that they've suffered and they're all guilty equally. So go with our side, the kindest side.
Thank you, Mr. Koh.
And we mentioned right from the start that in cases of human rights violations, in cases of genocide, and in cases of war, legal principles still apply. We mentioned right from the start that there's nothing that makes such circumstances any different from other situations where we do apply and abide by the define the hate of the nations, but these principles are not definitive, and I know that because I was going to say that. We try to hate and individuals as the courts deem fit and according to their discretion. And then the second thing that they accuse us about with regard to plea bargaining. In fact, what I mentioned was that plea bargaining was an aspect of these processes used in order to obtain crucial evidence and witnesses' accounts. We never once said that these individuals who abide by plea bargaining will then go off scot-free. So we think that the opposition has in fact misrepresented the proposition's case seriously. And in fact, opposition never just proved with us on our entire idea and logic that there should and must be equality in law, that laws cannot afford to have variations in outcome simply because variations are inconsistent and variations are unjust. So with that, two main issues that this debate has brought down to. First, is justice sought in truth and reconciliation commissions? And second, is true reconciliation even achieved by these commissions? So first of all, with regard to justice. Now what happens in the opposition's paradigm is that they are going to allow truth and reconciliation commissions and they're going to grant amnesty to anyone who comes forward who tells his testimony and cooperates with it. We challenge them on what exactly they mean by cooperation and how they will ascertain that this full cooperation is achieved. And in fact, we think that their entire sense cannot be supported simply because they are disregarding with the fundamental principle of retribution. To which the only response they told us was that, retribution is not all that important. Now, how then can such a crucial tenet of justice be disregarded so conveniently? The opposition merely asserted and never told us why, in all other circumstances, we abide fully by the tenets of justice, by the principle of retributive justice, and yet in these circumstances, in genocide and in the war, we are then going to forsake these all of a sudden and take this shift in principle. We think that retribution is integral in achieving justice because once we ascertain that guilt, that there is guilt involved, then punishment must follow, retribution must occur. In fact, we have already told you how TRCs will in fact provide a very easy way out for dictators because they see that there is an option of amnesty that's available. And so, because TRCs overemphasize the role of reconciliation, it's so easy for these dictators to simply apply and be granted amnesty before they even want to agree to set up these TRCs in their countries in the first place. And this opens up a system of abuse that we as proposition are not prepared and not willing to see. Second point is true reconciliation achieved by TRCs. We told you that victims need to be the ones to agree to forgive their perpetrators, and that we want the people and not the state to forgive. To which the only response was that, the state decides for us all the time. We say, sure, because the state can decide and ascertain guilt, because things like guilt, whether a person is guilty or not, are objective. But when it comes to things that are so subjective and personal and intrinsic, things like giving up forgiveness, whether or not I want to agree to forgive my perpetrator, then we don't think the state has a place in intervening there. So therefore, we think no one needs to tell anyone to forgive, and forgiveness can only truly be achieved when the victims themselves see that their perpetrators are being prosecuted criminally, that justice is being meted out. So ultimately, with all the other shit, we are extremely proud to propose such resolution.
And it certainly lived up to the promise that was made at the start, a debate with a high level of engagement and contact between the sides. So we thought that was really good, and both sides deserve a round of applause. The judges looked at a couple of things. I'll first tell you the issues on which we gave the debate. The first was the definition of justice. Is justice something that ought to be controlled by the notion of retribution, or are there more complex features, reconciliation, rehabilitation, that we need to consider? Second, how do we best help society move on? An interrelated question with what's the definition of justice. How do we best find closure? And then given, and how do we best serve justice in such a way that society is able to put this behind them and move on from the conflict? So the side that was able to persuade us that their model was able to do this was the side that took the debate. So those are the issues on which we gave it. There were also a couple of skills that the judges were looking out for that also helped swing our decision. The first was consistency, both in terms of the principle that the side advocated for, as well as the model with which they wanted to use to actualize that principle. Who presented to us a more robust principle that would more realistically be applied. Second, responsiveness. Which was the side that paid attention closer to what the other side said and was able to respond to the specific and precise logic and language that the other side was using. The judges were unanimous in our decision, and I'll leave it to the chair and the organizers to tell you what that result was. But once again, congratulations to both teams for having made it so far.